Hey, welcome everyone to the course on Shaul HaMelech. I'm excited you're joining us. In this course, we will focus on different stories about Shaul HaMelech. We're going to talk, of course, a lot about his life in general, and we're going to focus on understanding, um, like what's going on with all of the different, famous stories that we know about Shaul, with Shaul and HaMelech and Shaul and David, right? We have all these stories about Shaul HaMelech. And we know, of course, that Shaul was worthy of becoming the first king of the Jewish people, right? That's not a job that, should be taken lightly, right? That is a major position that he was given. And then when we look at what he did in that position, it's pretty shocking, right? Like, how did he behave the way that he did? And of course, we know that when we learn Torah, right, we have to really understand what's actually taking place, right? We can't just read stories on a surface level, but we need to actually understand what was taking place, what challenges the person was confronted with, how and why did he respond in that way, and what actually took place, right? When we look according to the Mefarshim and according to Chazal, what actually was taking place, right? Not just like our childish surface understanding of what was taking place. So although we will be focusing on the stories of Shaul HaMelech, the larger goal that we have in this class is to develop an understanding of how do we look at stories in Tanakh in the proper way, right? And we're going to focus on the approach that's called the Gadlus Ha'adam approach, which is when we ask the obvious questions of how is it that this person, this great tzaddik, could have been involved in actions that seems so beneath who he was, right? So again, we're going to focus on Shaul HaMelech, but we're going to use that as a way of understanding how do we approach these stories. We know Shaul had to be, the Torah tells us that he was worthy of being the first king. We're going to discuss all of the different descriptions that the Navi gives to Shaul that shows that he was a great person, right? And again, he was worthy of being the first king of the Jewish people. That's a major position. So how can it be that he then did certain things that we would look at and think like this is so low, it's so embarrassing? So how could that be? And again, we're going to hopefully develop this process of learning that will enable us to look at any story in Tanakh, whether in Chumash or in Nach, and to be able to ask the right questions of what was taking place and to know how to find the answer of what actually took place, right? And we're going to see that when we first look at the stories of Shaul, it's sometimes hard to understand how these stories are really relevant for us, right? Like what was going on, right? A lot of the stories are obviously not very relevant to our life experience. We're obviously not being given the same missions that Shaul was given as king of the Jewish people, right? But also when we look at the stories and it seems like he just ignored what Hashem told him, we don't have a lot to learn from that, right? It's like, oh, Shaul was told to do something, he ignored Hashem, and he was punished. There isn't a lot to learn from that kind of understanding of the story. But when we delve deeply and analyze what Shaul actually did on a deep level, what were the mistakes that he made, what was the incorrect thoughts that he had, when we really understand what Shaul was going through, we're going to see that the stories are extraordinarily relevant and it's life-changing to learn from the stories of Shaul HaMelech. So that will be the goal in this class, again, to learn about Shaul, to have a larger understanding of the approach to learning Torah that we're going to hopefully develop together, and to then come away with really relevant ideas of how the Torah expects us to live our lives as Torah Jews. So today, before we actually start talking about Shaul, we're going to look at different sources, different Sfarim that speak about this concept of the Gadlus Ha'adam approach to learning Tanakh. So first of all, in general, the Gadlus Ha'adam approach is an idea that we've had in a bunch of Livnos courses, so I'm not really going to address it at all. It's been addressed many times, mostly by Rav Shurin. He has a few courses about Gadlus Ha'adam. Gadlus Ha'adam means the greatness of the human being. Rav Shurin has a bunch of courses on this. They're all recorded, and I'm happy to share with anyone who's interested. And we do have other teachers throughout Livnos, they'll reference this idea. The Gadlus Ha'adam idea is basically that every human being possesses essential greatness because we were created with a Tzelem Elokim, right? We were created with a Tzelem Elokim. It's amazing to think about that every person possesses a Tzelem Elokim, something that makes us similar in some way to Hashem. We possess some similarity to Hashem himself. That's an amazing thing, right? No other being, no other part of creation possesses this similarity to Hashem. It's amazing to think about, right? And the Gadlut Adam idea is, if we truly understand how great we are as human beings, we are godly, we are divine beings. If we really understood who we are, so then we would have a whole different approach to life. We would hold ourselves to much higher standards. We would possess so much, we would really understand the dignity of the human being, and we'd approach ourselves differently, and we'd also deal with others differently, right? And this is an idea that, again, has been addressed many times, and I'm happy to share those sources. What we're going to do in this class is that we're going to take this approach to life, which is a Torah approach to life, right? The greatness of the human being. And we're going to develop this approach as an approach to learning Torah, right? Part of the Gadlut Adam approach is that a person is essentially great. We all possess a Tzelem Elokim. But as time goes on, we become less aware of the fact that we are a Tzelem Elokim. In earlier generations, they understood that they possess a Tzelem Elokim, and so they lived up to it, right? If we would really, really understand and be conscious always of the fact that we are godly beings, then we would live our lives in a different way, right? We would hold ourselves to higher standards, right? This would be a natural, we would look at so many of the averos that the Torah warns us against, and we would naturally stay away from them, right? It's so below who we are. So what happened was, as time goes on, people become less aware of who they are. And that's the concept of Yeridas Hadoros, according to this idea, is that people are still essentially great. We still possess the same Tzelem Elokim that Adam possessed, right? All through history, every human being has the same Tzelem Elokim. We're still essentially great. However, as time goes on, we lose that recognition. And so we behave in ways that are less worthy of our Tzelem Elokim. And again, this is the concept of Yeridas Hadoros, that as time goes on, we become less great. It's not that we're essentially less great, but it's that we don't live up to that essential greatness that we possess. So this is the idea. And again, in the Sfarim, that discuss this idea of Gadlut Adam, so they'll discuss these kind of, ideas as well. Now, this concept of Yeridas Hadoros, though, is very, very important when it comes to this approach to learning Torah. Because what it teaches us is that the generations who came before us were on a much higher level. And every generation, we're going to look at sources in a minute that discuss this, that every generation is greater than the generation that comes after it, right? When we look to the previous generation, they were on a much higher level than we are. And every generation, there's a clear difference in each generation from one generation to the next. Which means when we go back, and we're going to look at a source that says this, but when we go back all the way to the people of Tanakh, you can't even understand, we can't even understand the difference between us and the people in Tanakh. The difference is so huge. We literally can't relate to them. This is something, we're going to quote a few sources very often in this class. One of them is the Or HaGanos. We're going to look at that in a moment. That the Or HaGanos is a sefer. It's the Torah of the Alter of Slobodka. In Slobodka, this is one of the main ideas that they would focus on, the idea of Gadlut Adam and this approach to learning Torah. So the Or HaGanos, which is the Torah of the Alter of Slobodka, is all about this concept of the greatness of the human being and how to understand stories in Tanakh. Another sefer we're going to look at very often is the Leket Sichos Musar, and that is also from Rav Yitzchak Isaac Sher. He was also part of Slobodka. He was actually the teacher of Rav Avigdor Miller. Rav Avigdor Miller, if you look at his Sfarim, it's also all about the concept of Gadlut Adam, and he'll say, I got this from my teacher, Rav Yitzchak Isaac Sher, who wrote the Leket Sichos Musar. So in the Leket Sichos Musar, he has so many beautiful explanations of the people of Tanakh. It's just like beyond. When you look at how he discusses them, how he talks about them, it's amazing. And one of the things that he says when he talks about the avos and imahos is he says that we tend to think that we can actually relate to them. Like these were people, they lived life, we lived life. They were human beings, we were human beings. They raised children, we raised children, right? We tend to think like, oh, there's a similarity here. We're all, we eat, they ate, we drink, they drank, right? Like we think, oh, we're all kind of similar. But what he says is that actually we can't relate at all. That's a mistake to think that we can at all relate to the avos and imahos. They were people, they lived their lives in a way, it was so like the level of avodas Hashem that they were, that they were constantly involved in. It was just, it's beyond our understanding, right? So these were people, when you look at these Sfarim, they say, you can't approach these people in Tanakh the way that you just approach, your life. You think like, oh, I made this mistake, they made this mistake, right? It's not like that. We really can't relate to them. Now, again, it's not to say that we shouldn't try to be like them, because they possess the Tselem Elokim and we possess the Tselem Elokim. That's the same. We're supposed to try to be like them, right? The Torah demands that we behave like them because, again, essentially we're the same. We possess a Tselem Elokim. However, we're not at that level yet. And because we're not at that level yet, we have to make sure that when we learn the stories of the people in Tanakh, we don't diminish them. And we don't think like, oh, they were like me. I also make these mistakes. We can't think like that. They were on a completely different level. And we have to, again, approach them with the proper respect that they deserve. And we have to say, how can someone on their level possibly do this? I might know how I could have done this action, but how can it be that someone like Avraham did this action? Someone like David, someone like Shaul? How can it be that these people who were so great, how could it be that they did this action? Okay, now let's look into the first source. I'm going to show them on the screen, but I also sent them to you in case you would like to, look at them on your own. Okay. Okay, so here, the first source we're going to look at, the first source we're going to look at is the Or HaGanos. Again, this is from the Altar of Slobodka, and I just want to mention, we're going to look at this source a lot, so it's important for you to know this. The Or HaGanos is also sometimes called the Or HaTzafon. It has to do, I don't know, something to do with the different printing and copywriting and that kind of stuff. I don't really know what it has to do with. But just so you're aware, this piece that I'm showing you can be found in either the Or HaGanos and the Or HaTzafon. It's really the same sefer. Okay. And here again, what we're going to discuss here is the concept of the difference between every generation and the concept of Yeridas Hadoros. Okay. So he says here, Hava nisbonin begadlusam shel hadoros hakadmonim. Let's understand. This is in the middle of another piece he's talking about. And he says here, let's, before we continue, let's understand the greatness of the generations who came before us. Kivar amanu b'sichotenu al gedulaso shel adam shenivra b'tselem. He says already in our sichos, we've already discussed the greatness of the human being who is created again with the Tselem Elokim. It says about the human being that that he's just a tiny bit less than divine. Right? Think about that. We're called the Tselem Elokim. It's an amazing thing. The Malachim, right, who are purely spiritual beings, they don't possess a Tselem Elokim. But we as human beings, we possess a Tselem Elokim. We're somehow connected to Hashem. We're somehow similar to Hashem in a way that no other being is similar to Hashem. It's amazing. Right? V'hu gadol mikol malachei hashares. He's even greater than the malachim. It's amazing. L'rabos hachashuvim beyoser. Right? Here, when it says that we're greater than the malachim, it means, even greater than the highest beings. Ukeshasha'alu hamalachim la'kadosh baruch hu. When the angels asked Hashem, Adam zeh ma tivo, this human being, what is his nature? Amar lahem, he said to them, Chachmaso meruba mishalachem. His chachma is greater than yours. Right? The human being in so many places, we talk about the greatness of the human being, even over the malachim. It's amazing. Vizden amar b'chol adam. And this greatness that we've discussed is talking about every human being. B'chol mi asher b'shem adam yechoneh. Anyone who falls under the title of human being. The kol shekain, that's any person. V'kol shekein adam Yisrael. And even more so, a person of the Jewish people. Shekol echad mehem hapashut biyoter. Every one of the Jewish people, even the most simple Jew, mevarech b'chol yom bracha miyuchedes. He says every day a bracha of shalo asani goy, right? That I was not created as a non-Jew, right? We know that the difference between a Yisrael and a regular human being, right, is huge. It's a huge difference. So think about that for a second. Every human being possesses this amazing Tselem Elokim, and a Yisrael is even higher than that. That's amazing. Okay, the Imbehedyot came. And now this is talking, when we say that every Jew says the bracha of Shalo Asani Goy, this is talking about even regular Jews. So the Imbehedyot came. If this is talking about even regular Jews, Kal v'chomer ba'adam Yisrael ha'osek ba'Torah. Imagine even more so, a Jew who is constantly involved in Torah, v'hu memadregas Talmid Chacham, and he's even on the level of someone who's a Talmid Chacham. That's an amazing thing. Think about that level of a person. Val achat kama v'kama b'misha gadol b'Torah, and even more so, not just someone who's involved in Torah or someone who is maybe even like a Talmid Chacham, but someone who is a gadol b'Torah. Af b'dorenu, even in our times, b'shas, b'poskim, b'charifos, b'b'kiyos, right? Even in our time, somebody who is a gadol in Torah. Think about that level, right? We're just going level upon level. There's the rest of human, the rest of creation, right? Looks to the human being. We are the Tselem Elokim. And the human being, even higher than that, is a Yisrael. Even higher than that is someone who's involved in Torah. Even higher than that is a Gadol b'Torah. ונמשיך להתבונן לפי זה, מהי מדרגת חכמי התורה בדורות שלפנינו. And now let's understand the level of the Chachmei Torah that came in earlier generations. כשאנו מעיינים בספרי האחרונים, אנו מתפעלים מחריפות מוחותיהם ומעומק והיקף חידושיהם. When we delve into the Sfarim of the Achronim, we're in awe, right, of the sharpness of their minds and the depth and breadth of their chidushim, right? We're in awe when we look in the Sfarim from people around our time. We're in awe of the depth that we see there, the amazing Torah. V'heim einam ela mefarshim et divrei kodmeihem. And these Achronim, all they're doing is explaining the words of those who came before them. They're just trying to explain and clarify the words of the great people who came before them. V'kodmeihem mefarshim et divrei ha'achronim kodmeihem. Right? And those people who came before them, they're also involved in this of clarifying those who came before them. Right? The Achronim, the Gedolei Torah in our time, look to the Gedolei Torah of the previous generation, who look to the Gedolei Torah of the previous generation. Everyone, all the amazing depth that they're bringing out is only building on what came before them. It's only clarifying what came before them. V'kodmei kodmeihem, right? This is every generation. Va'achronim mefarshim et divrei harishonim, darga achrei darga, right? All of the later ones are mefarshim, are explaining the ones who came before them. Every level, every generation is explaining one more level. Ve'ein shi'ur la'omek hadvarim ula'archavat ha'havana v'ha'asaga, right? There's no limit to the profundity that we see in all of this Torah. There's just no limit, right? And every generation is just trying to clarify the generation that came before them. So imagine this, if this is the Achronim, right? And then after a few generations back, it goes back to the Rishonim. And every, we're not even talking here, by the way, we tend to split it up as, Tanaim, Amoraim, right? And then eventually Rishonim, Achronim. Here he's saying that before you even split it up that way, go generation to generation, right? A Gadol who was writing Torah at the end of the 1900s, he's looking to the Achronim in the 1800s, right? Who's looking at the Achronim in the 1700s. We haven't even gotten to the Rishonim period yet. but even every generation. But now let's continue and imagine this even more. But let's say now we go through the Achronim and we go back all of the generations to the Rishonim. And now we reach the period of the Geonim. Imagine the difference between today and the Geonim. It's beyond every generation. I mean, this is before Rashi. Imagine before Rashi. Sharabanan Savorai. And then you go before the Geonim and you go to the Savoraim. Shal Chachmei Talmud. Shenemar Alehem. Right now, let's go back to the Chachmei Talmud. Right, the Amoraim. Shenemar Alehem, which it says about them. Sha'akatan shebahem haya yachol lahachayot mesim. That even the lowest among them was able to be mechaye mesim. That's amazing. This is who we're talking about in the Amoraim. V'chol dar haya gadol mehadar shelefanav. Right, and every generation was greater than the every generation is greater than the generation that comes after them. Okay. At Rav Zera Amar, until Rav Zera says, Im Rishonim Kemalachim. If, and this is, right, this is an important, this is, important in the concept of Yeridas Hadoros. Im Rishonim Kemalachim. If the earlier ones were like angels, Anu Kivnei Anashim. We are like human beings. Vim Rishonim B'nei Anashim. And if the earlier ones were like human beings, Anu kachamorim. We are like donkeys. V'lo kechamoro shel Rav Chanina ben Dosa, v'lo kechamuro shel Rav Pinchas ben Yair. Right? And this isn't talking, don't think when he says, if the earlier ones were like angels, we're like human beings. And if they were like human beings, we're like donkeys. Don't think we're talking about the donkeys here of Rav Chanina ben Dosa and Rav Pinchas ben Yair, these were special donkeys, right? We have the stories about them where they knew about keeping halacha. Right? Don't think we're talking about these kind of donkeys like, wow, that's actually a pretty high level to get to, right? No, we're not talking about those donkeys. If the earlier people are like human beings, we're like donkeys. And which donkeys? Like other donkeys, like those regular donkeys. Okay? We can't even imagine the difference. If one generation is like angels, the next generations are just mere human beings. But if that generation was human beings, the next generation is just donkeys. Okay, klomar, meaning to say, shadar achad leumas hasheni, that one generation compared to the next generation, hayami sug acher legamre. It's completely different. It is completely different. Kehevdel ben adam lechamar, like the difference between a human being and a donkey. V'chein midor ladar, and this is, he says, every generation to generation. Now, ve'im legabe hadorot ha'moraim kach, al achat kama v'kama legabe doros hatanaim. Right? And if this is true in the difference between the generations of the Amoraim, think about the difference between the generations of the Tanaim. V'kach amar Rav Yishmael ben Oshel Rav Yossi ben Chalafta. And here's a description that's given about the generations, the difference between the generations of the Tanaim. Kishim shebein zahav la'afar. Just like the difference between gold and dust. Kach bein dorenu l'doro shel Abba. That's the difference between our generation to my father's generation, right? To our father's generation. Here is a difference between one generation within Tanaim, the difference between one generation to the next. It's the difference between gold to dust. That's how he describes it. And he says here, the Oraganos, Yesh shiva suge matechet. There are 7 different kinds of substances. Each one is better than the next, right? Until we come to the substance of gold. Vinei ha'erich Rav Yishmael ben Rav Yossi shedoro shel aviv haya b'sheva madregos yoter gadol mimidregos doro. Right, and here Rav Yishmael, he assesses the difference between the generations. Right, it's these full 7 levels, complete difference. Right, like the difference between gold to dust. Right, again, all of these explanations, descriptions that we have of the difference between generations of gold to dust, that's one generation. That's not even, Tanaim to Amoraim. It's within the generations of the Tanaim. This is how we look at the difference between every generation. Right here we have again the Amoraim, the description is gold to dust. Before we had the description is angels to human beings or human beings to donkeys, right? These are again all the differences in one generation. So again, if we were to go back full periods of Jewish history, right, the generation would be, we can't even imagine the difference, right? It would be complete difference, right? Like it's complete essential difference. Okay, v'gam Rebbe, k'shahaya mevakesh la'ashiv al divrei Rabbi Yossi hayomer. And this is what Rebbe says about it. Anu ha'aluvim ashivim al divrei Rabbi Yossi. Okay, and here he says, we the low ones, this is, this is how we understand the difference between this is how he understands these words that we just discussed. Kishem shebein kadshei agdashim. Just like the difference between the Kadshei Hakdashim, right, the holiest of holies, lebein chule chulen, from the holiest of holies to the most mundane. That difference, kach bein doreinu ledor shel Rav Yossi. That's a difference between our generation to Rav Yossi. The difference between our generation to Rav Yossi's is the difference between the Kadshei Hakdashim, the holiest of holies, to lebein chule chulen, to the most mundane. That's a difference, again, just between his generation to Rav Yossi's generation. Okay, so that is a profound difference. B'dvarim ela amurim b'dor echad. And these words are speaking about one generation. The imkain, if this is true, kama itzrachaku doro tatanaim harishonim me'atanaim hachronim. So imagine now you take the first generation of Tanaim and you compare them to the last generation of Tanaim, right? That's a huge difference. V'lamala mehem, and now even let's compare them to generations before them. To Anshe Knesset HaGedola, V'ador Shel HaNaviim. Now imagine you compare these generations of Tanaim, right, to the Anshe Knesset HaGedola or to the Neviim. Complete difference. And if we keep doing this, right, how great is each generation before that. Now let's try to understand how great the generation of the Midbar was. The Dor Deya, how great they must have been. Dor Yotzei Mitzrayim, these were the people who left Mitzrayim. Shera'a et kol ha'otot va'amovtim shena'asa lahem b'Mitzrayim. They saw all of those great wonders that Hashem did in Mitzrayim. Right? You imagine what it was like to experience what was taking place in Mitzrayim when we learn about it, to see the Yad Hashem, and to see Hashem comes and Hashem makes a clear statement to the world of who Hashem is. Right? Hashem, we know that Hashem has all of the Makos were there. They were there to educate the world and to teach them about Hashem. You imagine what it was like for people to see that, to see such a clear revelation of Hashem in this world. This Dar Yotzei Mitzrayim, that's what they saw. They witnessed Yad Hashem in a way it was unbelievable. And that was just in Mitzrayim. What else did they see? V'shechazal amru alav. And Chazal say about this generation, Shema shalu ra'a Yechezkel ben Buzi b'maaseh merkava. What Yechezkel ben Buzi wasn't even able to see in the Maaseh Merkava, Ra'asa Shivcha al Hayam. Even the regular people of the Yotzei Mitzrayim, even they saw at Kriyas Yamsov. Right? We know that Yechezkel has the vision of the Maaseh Merkava, right, which was supposed to be a revelation of Hashem in an amazing way, right? We're not even supposed to learn the Maaseh Merkava because we can't even understand it. Right? What Yechezkel was able to see of the Maaseh Merkava, which again was a revelation of Hashem's like Hashem, right? We don't even understand exactly what's going on in that Maaseh Merkava. But this was a revelation of Hashem that Yechezkel saw. Yechezkel, it was a huge level of nevuah that Yechezkel saw. And we're told that the people who left Mitzrayim, when they were there on Kriyas Yamsov, they had a nevuah that was even greater than that. Everyone had an even greater level of nevuah than Yechezkel HaNavi, who saw the Maaseh Merkava. That's an amazing thing, right? We can't even understand. Again, to try to relate to these people, to think that maybe we're in some way similar to them, we're in some way, we can relate to them, we understand what they were going through, we, do things the way no, totally not. We have no understanding of who they were, right? Again, to look at the stories, and we're going to actually do this a little bit tonight, but to look at the stories of the people who were in the Midbar, the Dordeya, and to think like, oh, they complained. Oh, we complained. Oh, they didn't recognize Hashem. Yeah, we don't always recognize Hashem. We can't even understand. These were people, they had such an understanding of Hashem in this world that we can't even relate to, right? So to think like, oh, we're kind of on the, oh, I can understand what they were going through. And, that was a mistake of theirs. No, we can't even understand what they were going through. We can't even understand their mistakes. That's what we really need to understand. What we're going to see tonight from the sources. We can't even understand their mistakes. We shouldn't even think that we understand their mistakes. Okay, that's the idea of what's going on here. Let's just finish this up. Sha'amdu al Har Sinai, right? This Dordeya, they saw the Osos and the Mosim in Mitzrayim. They saw what happened at the Yam Suf, and they witnessed Har Sinai. Har Sinai, right? Har Sinai is like the core of everything that we believe. It's amazing. And the revelation of Hashem at Har Sinai, right? V'ra'u v'shamu, it's called Hashem medaber aleihem. They saw and they heard Hashem speaking to them. We literally can't even understand what that means. That's what these people witnessed. Shahayu shuruyim tamid tachas kanfei hashchina. They were constantly immersed, right? And they were living under, with the Shechina. Sha'anane hakavod sachachu aleihem yomam valayla. The anane hakavod were constantly protecting and covering them. The Aron bris Hashem holech lefnehem v'chule v'chule. Right? The Aron was leading the way before them. Right? We literally can't even understand these concepts. And to think that we can relate to them, we understand them, that kind of thing. It's so foolish of us. We literally have no concept of who these people were. No concept. We can barely understand the people who came 100 years ago. But to think we can understand these people, the Yotzei Mitzrayim, then we don't understand what's going on. If we can read a story about the Dordeya and we think that they were like doing something foolish, it means we don't understand what was going on, because we can't even understand the greatness of who they were. And to think that we can understand like the mistakes they made, or we would look at them chas v'chalila and think like, oh, those fools, they didn't really know what they were supposed to do. They didn't understand what Hashem wanted of them. We can't even relate. We can't understand what they thought about the world. These were people who had a connection with Hashem that we can't even imagine. We can only wish that someday we can have such a relationship with Hashem. But to look down at them, it means we don't really understand what was taking place. Okay, so that is the basic idea of this concept. Again, here we looked at Yeridas Hadoros, and what we want to see then is, how do we understand this concept of Yeridas Hadoros, right? How do we use that as a way of then understanding what actually did take place in Tanakh, right? Because again, the goal is not to just say, oh, these people were so great, we can't even understand them. The point is to say that these people were so great and they were dealing on a very, very high level. If they made a mistake, then we need to learn from their mistake. If they made a mistake, of course we're making the same mistake. So, how can we learn from them? How can we learn in some way from what they went through and how Hashem taught them, the proper way to go about things? I just want to mention that this concept of the Gadlut Ha'adam approach to learning Torah and this concept of Yeridas Hadoros, it's important when we look. Now it's going to enable us that when we look at stories in Tanakh and stories in the Gemara, right? When we look at stories of earlier generations, so it's going to enable us to look at those stories and to ask the obvious question. Again, why did Avraham do this? Why did David do this? Why did the Dordeya do this? Right? Those are the questions that we need to ask. Because again, it can't be that if we look at the Shvatim and we think the Shvatim did something foolish, it can't be. This is the Shiftei Ka. These were great, great tzaddikim that we can't even understand. So clearly, when we look at the story of the Shvatim and they sold Yosef, clearly they didn't just sell their brother because they were jealous, right? Clearly not. These were great, great tzaddikim. Even today, if somebody sold their brother because they were jealous, we would think that they were crazy. Clearly, the Shvatim weren't doing something that, we would think like, wow, they must have been insane. Clearly not. So we have to look at those stories and say, well, what were the Shvatim thinking? What was Avraham thinking? What was the Dor Deya thinking? Why did they do the Chet HaEgel? Does it make sense that the Dor Deya, who just witnessed the Makos, crossed the Yam Suf and got that very high level of Nevuah, then they stood at Har Sinai? Does it make sense that they would then make an idol of a calf and serve it? Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? These are the questions that we have to ask. When we look in the Gemara and we read about the Tanaim and things that they did, and we think, well, that's weird. Why did they do it? We need to ask that question of why did they do it? Because these are the Tanaim, right? This is something that, again, it's very important when learning anything, Tanakh, Gemara, any Jewish history, right? Is to stop and to ask this question of, these were great people. Clearly, they weren't doing something that was insane. So what were they doing? What was going on here? And what do we need to learn from this? Okay, but I also just want to mention that there's another aspect of Torah learning where this comes in, and it's very important, which is when we read the Mefarshim, and we look at the Mefarshim, or we look at Chazal, explaining a story in Tanakh, this is also true. We don't dismiss the words of Rashi, because this was Rashi. He was a gadol in the time of the Rishonim, at the beginning of the period of the Rishonim, right? So his words are not the same as my words, and they're not even the same as the words of a gadol today, right? For sure, me, I'm not even like, no one's even discussing what I say, but a gadol today won't dismiss the words of Rashi. Of course not, right? But sometimes when we learn, we might look at something a Meforosh says and like, maybe we don't really agree. We can't look at it that way. These are gedolim. These are gedolim, Talmidei Chachamim, and if they lived in the period of the Rishonim, it's a joke to even think that we could disagree with them, that they need like my approval, right? That would be a joke. So again, this is important when learning Torah. This is important because when we examine stories, we need to understand who the people are who we're examining. But also we need to know that our guides in examining these people, the Rishonim, the Achronim, the Tanaim, the Amoraim, these guides know a lot more than me, right? They're able to analyze and to give over the Mesorah of what was taking place. But again, we can't either dismiss their words. So this is the core. This is the foundation of learning Torah properly, is to understand the concept of Yeridas Hadoros. I can't relate to the people of Tanakh the way I relate to myself. I can't relate to the Tanaim, the Amoram. I can't. I have to have that understanding that these were great, great people. And again, that understanding that I can't even think that I can relate to them. I need to understand that these are people who deserve respect. If Rashi says something and I think it sounds a little bit funny, so then the question isn't like, I shouldn't say something like, oh, Rashi was wrong. No, the question is, how am I either not understanding Rashi, or how do I have the wrong perspective on life that I clearly am wrong? So either I'm misunderstanding Rashi, in which case, okay, or I was wrong and Rashi is teaching me something. Turns out I was wrong and Rashi has the right perspective, right? But to ever look at, Gedolim and to think like, oh, I can assess what they say, that's totally incorrect, right? Again, even a Gadol today, I can't approve, he doesn't need my approval. But for sure, 800 years ago, 2,000 years ago, that would be crazy, right? That's not even like, that's just like funny. It's funny for us to think that we can, assess what these people say. Okay, so that's an important that's an important, again, foundation to have in learning Torah, and before we can start talking about Shaul HaMelech. Now, there's more to this idea. What I want to do before we actually go into the stories of Shaul, and we'll start this today, and then we'll continue this, Amir Tashem, next week, is I want to understand, like, what exactly is, taking place here, right? We just mentioned about the greatness of all of these generations, right? The greatness of, even the Achronim period, right? The earlier Achronim and the Rishonim and the Geonim and the Savoraim, right? All the way back, all the way to the Yotzei Mitzrayim, right? Here he mentions, he goes back to the Dor Deya, right? But if you go back again to the Avos and Imahos, those are way earlier generations, right? You go back from the Dor Yotzei Mitzrayim to the people who were in Mitzrayim, to the Shvatim, right? To Yaakov, to Yitzchak, to Avraham. We can't even understand Avraham, right? We literally can't even understand Avraham. Now the question is then, why is it that the Torah speaks in a way that's very it makes everyone look bad, right? If you look at Torah and you just read through the stories, everyone looks bad, right? And when people, and this is it can be a big challenge, right? Because if you talk to people who have never really learned Torah and all they've done is, they've read some stories in the Bible, right? Or people who maybe they read stories in the Chumash, but they never really analyzed it and they never really learned it properly. So they come away with this thought of like, these people were terrible, right? You hear them talking about some of the greatest tzaddikim in our history in such disrespectful ways, right? So what I want to understand together is, why is it that the Torah is speaking in this way? And the other part is, how do we start to decode it, right? How do we, as people who are coming and we want to learn the stories properly? So what's going on here? How do we understand these stories that are speaking so negatively about these people? Well, how do we understand what was taking place, right? These stories they're written so harshly. Like, so how do we understand what was taking place? Okay, so we're gonna look at a few different sources, and I'm gonna point out two basic ideas. I'm sure we could come up also with other ways of like decoding, right? But here I want to mention two different, let's say, two ways we can understand how the Torah speaks, so that again we can start to understand how to look at a story properly. So the first piece that I want to discuss, and this is again the language of the Torah, and this is true about all of Tanakh. Okay, there are at some point in the course, I hope we'll discuss this a little bit about the difference between how the Chumash speaks and how the Nevi'im speaks. Okay, but this general rule is true about all of Tanakh, which is that the Torah has very, very high demands for us. Okay, the Torah is not, it's not like a fluffy, system where like whatever you're doing is fine, everyone's just like perfect the way they are, right? The Torah has very harsh demands for us. It expects a lot. Whatever level a person is on, there's more to do, right? The Torah expects a level from us, a level of perfection, right? The demands of the Torah are so deep. We know, right? We know, in the Or Haganos, he says, we tend to think like, okay, the Torah was given and it says all of these things. He says, but think about the fact that the Torah was given to Moshe. Moshe also had to keep the Torah and he also had to continue growing. So when Moshe got, for example, when Moshe got the command, don't murder, and Moshe and the Jewish people at that time, again, the Dor Deah, got the command, don't murder. The Or Haganos says, don't think that it was like, oh, check, we're done. Now, of course, again, the Dor Deah, they were not murderers, right? They were definitely not murdering people. And yet, the Or Haganos says the fact that they also received this mitzvah means even they have something that they need to work on in that command. And what he says is that don't murder doesn't literally mean just don't murder. It means everything that falls under that category. It's a broad category. It's not a narrow category of don't murder. It's a broad category. And part of that category is don't embarrass someone. Don't embarrass someone, right? We know we have statements in Chazal that say that if someone embarrasses another person, it's like they murdered them. So he says, for someone to embarrass another person, they would actually be transgressing don't murder. Now, again, don't embarrass someone doesn't just mean, oh, think about how easy it is to embarrass someone, right? It comes up a lot. People can be embarrassed pretty easily, right? So to be careful that someone should never be embarrassed, that's a huge demand, right? And again, if we were to go even on Moshe's level, I'm sure Moshe was not, embarrassing people very often, right? But on Moshe's level, even he was able to go deeper and to understand don't murder meant even more, right? For example, the Or Haganos does not say this, but I think part of this Gadlus Adam idea, right, is that every person, right, is a Tselem Elokim, which means we have to respect every person. Which means, I think, if we don't give somebody a certain, the proper respect of a tselem Elokim. Now, again, imagine what that's like. Do we really walk around in our lives and treat every single person as if they're godly? Like, that's a very high level to get to, right? To really relate to every person as if this is a godly human being. But if we don't, I think in a way that can be murdering, right? Because this is the essence of the person and we are not respecting that. We're diminishing it. We're looking down at them, right? And again, that's a very high level to constantly relate to every person as a Tselem Elokim. That's very high level, right? And if let's say we walk by someone and we don't say hi to them, we just ignore them, which is very rude, right? The Torah talks about the importance of greeting people, right? And again, this is a Tselem Elokim. Do we just walk by and ignore Hashem? Like, that would be crazy, right? So I think even if we were to walk by someone and to not give them the proper respect they deserve, that could even fall under this category of don't murder. Again, the Oregoners didn't say that specifically, but from what I was looking at from him, that's what it seems to me, is that if you go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into each of these mitzvos or mitzvos lo saseh, there are so many levels of what it means, right? And Moshe, on his level, again, he wasn't dealing with not murdering, but even on his level, there was something he had to, become greater in. He had to work on and he had to change, right? So the Oregano says, if you think the Torah's demands are like, oh, don't murder, don't steal, don't no, you don't understand. These are very, very, very serious demands. They go to there's so much that's involved in this category. It's almost impossible to imagine how we could truly keep all of it. And yet, this is what the Torah demands of us. Yeah, we have to keep going deeper and deeper and working on ourselves because the Torah has very, very high demands for us. Okay? So the first thing that he says is that the Torah has very high demands. But again, then he has other articles. I took a bunch of articles from the Or HaGanos. And I didn't bring them for you because there are tons of different articles. But he says elsewhere that if you look at the Torah, the terms that the Torah uses are not the same terms that we use. We're going to see one article about this. But he says, now again, here we just saw don't murder means different things for different people, right? And all of us are, again, supposed to get on every level higher and higher until we reach, the level of Moshe Rabbeinu. But if it says about Moshe Rabbeinu, let's just say the pasuk says, and Moshe Rabbeinu murdered someone. So again, for Moshe Rabbeinu, the term murder means something else, right? Here he has an article where he says that the Torah's concept of meriva, of fighting, right? We know there are a few places it talks about different people fighting with other people. And he says you have to understand what the concept of fighting means to the Torah. And he goes on to explain that Moshe Rabbeinu, we know that Moshe, when Korach and his group, right, went and they attacked Moshe, and they did something very serious. This was very, very serious. Moshe represents, and Moshe is giving over the Torah, the Dvar Hashem, right? That's one of the Ikrei Emunah, to believe that Moshe is giving over the Torah. If somebody challenges Moshe's authority, then they are literally, attacking the very essence of everything we believe. This is a very serious matter. And we know that Korach's punishment and everything that flowed from that is very, very serious. This was not a small thing. And we know that during the event of what took place with Korach, Moshe said that he wants to make peace with Dasan and Aviram, right? And he went to them. Moshe never asked for this fight. He wasn't involved in the fight at all. He was being attacked. He was completely passive. But he decided to be proactive and to approach Dasan and Aviram and to make peace. Now, Dasan and Aviram themselves had a very difficult history with Moshe, right? Dasan and Aviram, we know all of the instances in Mitzrayim, in the Midbar, right, that they kept challenging Moshe and saying things to him about how, terrible he's behaving. Even when Moshe was doing important jobs for the Jewish community. He was doing very important jobs. He was acting as a Shaliach Hashem. And Dasan and Aviram were there, to rebuke him, right? And to tell him that he was doing something wrong. Now, I want to just mention for a second and say, if you look in the Or HaGanos and the Leket Sichos Musar, they will tell you what Korach and Dasan and Aviram were thinking, why they were motivated to do what they did. And they'll talk about the greatness of Korach and Dasan and Aviram. Don't think that when we use this approach of Gadlus HaAdam, it only applies to tzaddikim. It applies to everyone in Tanakh. It's the only way to understand Tanakh. It applies to Esav. The Lekut Zichros Moser has beautiful, beautiful words, sichos, about how he describes the greatness of Esav. He talks about Hagar. Wow. The things he says about Hagar. Hagar married Avraham. Right? Think about that for a second. Hagar was worthy to marry Avraham. That's beyond. We can't even imagine who Hagar was. So again, I just want to say for a second, when we speak about anyone in Tanakh, they all deserve this approach of understanding these were great people. Korach was motivated. He had a very, very important, he had a whole understanding of why what he was doing was saving the Jewish people. Dasan and Aviram, they were worthy of leaving Mitzrayim. That's an amazing thing. Can you imagine Dasan and Aviram were worthy of leaving Mitzrayim? Most people were not worthy of leaving Mitzrayim, but they were, right? So again, I just want to say for a second that here we can't go into every story, right, in one class. But again, I don't want you to think, not to come away and to think like, oh, Moshe Rabbeinu was great, but everyone else, they were all Rishon. No, here, even Korach and Dasan and Aviram, they were great. But let's go back to the story. Here, Moshe, again, was being attacked by Korach and Dasan and Aviram and their group. And Korah and Moshe, again, had a history with Dasan and Aviram, an unpleasant history. And yet, Moshe, even though he had taken no part in this, Moshe said, I am going to be proactive and I'm going to come and try to make peace with Dasan and Aviram. And Chazal say that if Moshe hadn't been proactive and gone to Dasan and Aviram and tried to make peace, he would have been considered as if he was doing what Korach did. It would have been considered like he himself was fighting. He himself was part of the machlokas. If again, even though he was passive, if he hadn't done something active to make peace with Dasan and Aviram, it would have been considered as if he was an active part of the machlokas. Right? Which again, you say, well, why? He didn't actually do anything here. But again, the Torah's demands are very great. And if Moshe hadn't been actively trying to make peace, it would have been as if he had also been part of the machlokas. So again, the Or HaGanos, he mentions when he talks about this and he says, you have to understand that the Torah's terms are not the same terms as ours because the demands are very high. The Torah's demands are, if you are not actively engaged in trying to make peace, it's as if you are an active part of the machlokas. So again, if we look and it says about a tzaddik that he fought with someone, it doesn't mean that he was out there trying to make problems. It means that even if he was trying to make peace, if the Torah knows, if Hashem knows that there was, and Hashem knows everything. He can see to the depths of a person. If there's even a tiny, tiny, tiny lack in what the person could have done to make peace, they are considered having been someone who was fighting. They are considered part of the machlokas because there was even a tiny, tiny, tiny lack in their efforts to make peace. That's amazing. So again, when we look at the Torah, we have to understand the Torah is dealing with a very, very, very high level of demands of what it expects of a person. And it expects a level of perfection. That's what it expects. The Torah knows that we possess Tselem Elokim. That makes us unlimited. We are essentially great. We have the potential to be so, so, so great that if a person doesn't live up to their Tselem Elokim, then the Torah has some very harsh words for them. Okay? And again, the Or HaGanos has all different articles where he points out that even people who had reached levels of emunah and connection with Hashem, very, very high levels we can't even imagine. But they were held accountable because there was some lack in their life in what they were doing. And then the Torah records that for us, and it lets us know. Now, I don't want to start, the next piece that we're going to read since it's almost, the time is almost up. But I want to just tell you, we're going to read another piece from the Or HaGanos, and it's called Lashon HaTorah. And he's going to go through for us the language of the Torah, and he's going to show how there are certain stories in Tanakh where the Torah speaks about it in a way, again, it makes the people look terrible. If we understand that you need to decode the story, then Chazal show us what really took place. Now, again, the Torah is not trying to make a person look bad. The Torah is saying, I expect a level of perfection. You're able to reach that level. You are at Tselem Elokim. You are able to reach the level of perfection of being at Tselem Elokim. If you don't reach that very high level, then the Torah testifies, this person, he was involved in machlokas. This person, he was involved in this avera. Not because they actually were involved in the literal avera, but because they hadn't fulfilled their responsibility, their obligation. Okay, we're going to continue this idea next time. And again, we'll see it a little bit more in action. You saw a few examples, right? But we'll see a few more examples again of how the Torah has very, very high demands. And therefore, when a person doesn't live up to those demands, the Torah records it, and it records it in language that's very harsh. And again, that's why we need to know how to decode it. We will also mention other ways of why the Torah, of how the Torah records things, and it seems very, very harsh. But if we know how to decode it, we'll see it's not as harsh as it seems. Okay, and again, so we'll continue this introduction next time, and then we'll get into the stories about Shaul HaMelech. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Goodbye.